everyone. This is Carlos Garrido. I'm here with my comrade and Midwestern Marx editor, Kala Windshield, to welcome you all to our first Midwestern Marx panel. This is a space dedicated to discussing Marxist theory and situating it in relationship to contemporary issues and disciplines. For today's event, we will be discussing the topic of Marxism and human evolution. We will have three panelists, which will each give 10-minute presentations on the panel prompt they were assigned. Afterwards, they will be asked to reply to each other's presentations, and then we will conclude with some questions. Here are the panelists who will be joining us today. First, we have Thomas Riggins, who is a retired philosophy professor, formerly at NYU, New School University, and he also has a PhD from the City University of New York Graduate Center. He has been active in the civil rights and peace movements since the 1960s, when he was the chairman of the Young People's Socialist League at Florida State University, and where he worked for CORE in voter registration in North Florida. He has written for many online publications such as People's World and Political Affairs, where he was an associate editor. He also served on the board of the Bertrand Russell Society and was president of the Corliss Lamont chapter in New York City of the American Humanist Association. Next, we will have Mitchell K. Jones, who is a historian and activist from Rochester, New York. He has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a master's degree in history from the college at Rockport State University of New York. He has written on utopian socialism and the antebellum in the US. His research interests include early America, communal studies, antebellum reform movements, religious sects, working class institutions, labor history, abolitionism, and the American Civil War. His master's thesis, entitled Hunting for Harmony, the Skein, how do you say that, Mitch? Little help?
It's not like it's spelled. Skinny Atlas.
Skinny Atlas.
Skinny Atlas.
The Skinny Atlas Community and Communitism in Upstate New York from 1825 to 53 examines the radical abolitionist John Anderson Collins and his utopian project in Upstate New York. Jones is also a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And then lastly, we have Comrade Charles Brown, who is a political activist out of Detroit, Michigan. He has his degrees in anthropology and is a member of the bar. He teaches anthropology at community college, and his favorite slogan is, "What's good for the goose is good for the gander." Charles was also a former student of Marshall Sahlins, which for the topic that we're dealing with in today's panel, I think it's quite interesting. So thank you, and I'll pass it over to Kala to present the panel prompt. Comrade, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. The panelists were asked to respond to the following prompt. Towards the end of his life, Karl Marx turned his focus to anthropology and ethnological studies. His health and death made it impossible for him to publish anything substantial in this new field of study. Frederick Engels, however, was able to publish The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, a seminal work in Marxism, which was grounded on Lewis Henry Morgan's Ancient Society, a book that they both thought confirmed, elucidated, and expanded on some of the central positions they had developed decades earlier. In his Dialectics of Nature, a posthumously published unfinished work of Engels concerning the leading scientific developments of his day, there is also an important essay on human evolution entitled The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man. This essay was praised by one of the leading paleontologists and evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, Stephen Jay Gould. Considering the cursory aforementioned links between Marxism and the field of anthropology and human evolution, how does the relationship of Marxism to anthropology stand today? Is it any different than it was in the 1880s? How could one describe the relationship of Marxism to the discoveries made by the field of economic anthropology and figures like Karl Polanyi, Marcel Mauss, and Marshall Sahlins? What does economic anthropology tell us about the capitalist form of life in relation to the greater part of the history of the species? And how do the critiques which follow from these related to the Marxist critique of capitalist political economy and culture?
Perfect. So we'll start with Dr. Thomas Riggins.
I wish I'd have gotten that prompt. I was interested basically in Engels' work as how it has stood up in the 20th century with all the new information that has been gained in science, all the sciences, how that compares to what Marx and Engels wrote about science, and especially about anthropology. And I was especially interested in that the role, the Engels thing in the Dialectics of Nature, because I was subscribing, I used to subscribe to Science, and they had articles in there, the latest articles on what's going on in science. And that big article was in there about how the anthropologists had decided, or neuroscientists had decided back in 1995, a new theory about how the brain developed, and it had to do with dietary changes and cooking and the use of fire. And this would revolutionize our understanding of the evolution of people, our human evolution. And I said, well, that looks pretty familiar. I think I read that back in undergraduate, at an Engels work or something. And sure enough, there it was. Engels basically had the modern scientific view of human evolution back in the 1870s when he started taking these notes. Marx took notes too. But he, excuse me here. Kool-Aid. The only difference is, of course, he didn't have the fossil evidence that we have today. He didn't have, they had Neanderthals, but they didn't have, they had Homo erecti were discovered actually in the 1890s, but they weren't called Homo erecti, and Pithecanthropus erectus and people like that. But the basic idea that he had was that the fire allowed meat to be cooked and eaten, and that cut down the digestive process. And therefore, human beings had more leisure to do work, and it also allowed the brain to expand. And he also tied that in with the evolution of the hand, which came about as a result of bipedalism. And so basically, if you just overlook the level of science that they had, he was talking about hundreds of thousands of years, or we talk about millions now. They didn't think the Earth was more than a couple of million years old, I think, in his day. And now it's back to like 4 billion. So they didn't have the fossil evidence that you mentioned. Stephen Jay Gould, he wrote a very interesting book called It's a Wonderful Life, named after a Christmas movie that he liked, because he thought there was something in a Christmas movie and something in evolution which were paralleled, and that was the role of chance. And I'll get into him later, maybe in the question, into Gould's thing, and sort of tie in the evolution of man, which is in the Pleistocene, almost the most recent age, going back 1 million years, to the very origins of the type of life on all the Earth we have in the Cambrian period of 550 million years ago from Canada. So it seems to me the important thing that Engels wanted to point out was, in his essay, was that man and nature are not two separate categories of thought. And it was sort of like the Wikipedia has an article on these very articles on Engels' work here. It says that Engels rejected, as we know just from reading Engels, that the Marxists do not accept the dichotomy, the Cartesian dichotomy of mind and matter being completely separate. That what he did was show that human beings are part of nature, not some separate higher grade, and that we are able to, because of evolution and how we change, because I'm sure the other people will get into it, as we got into civilization, we've been able to think we can control nature. We thought we would master nature. But Engels pointed out the very things that we worry about today, that in our mastering of nature, because of the economic system we have, which is only interested in profit, we are not really concerned about what happens to nature after we have used it to make our products and make our material and oil, whatever we're using. And there could be a great economic price to pay, that is, nature could get its revenge on us. We know that just from regular history. Nova tonight, we won't be able to watch it. You can see on a repeat. Nova tonight is having a special on what happened to the Maya. And the Maya cut down their forests, and there were changes in the climate, and their civilization collapsed, and it got overgrown by jungle. So something like that, we're in a process where we could destroy our atmosphere to such an extent that the worldwide trade network and communication network we have will collapse, and we'll be on our own again. So that's my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mitch.
Thanks. Yeah, I actually realized I had a portrait of Lewis Henry Morgan off screen, so I put it on screen here. He's from the town that I am from, that I am in right now, Rochester, New York. He helped found the University of Rochester here, and he's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery, which is a cemetery where I have volunteered and things. I'm a member of one of the groups that takes care of that cemetery too. So yeah, a lot of connections here. So I'm going to talk about the objection that people often bring up in regards to communism and even socialism, or any sort of system that is perceived as a collectivistic endeavor. Often people say that communism is against human nature because humans are essentially greedy and selfish. But is that really true? Marx and Engels argued that human nature evolved along a dialectical trajectory based on conflict over material resources. So in light of this view, their bold proclamation in the 1848 Communist Manifesto that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle begs the question, what came before class struggle, before hitherto existing society? So in the manifesto, Marx and Engels sketch out a path of social evolution that continues to influence historical materials. Today, they wrote, in the earlier epochs of history, we find almost anywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. And almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that is sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class and antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of old ones. So in the manifesto there, they described epochs, ancient, feudal, and bourgeois, characterized by the complex relationships of oppressors to oppressed. But it wouldn't be until Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, published in 1884, that Engels attempted to explain what came before hitherto existing society, before the history of class struggle. So Engels wrote The Origin on the Family, as was mentioned in the prompt, using Marx's notes from a book that he had planned to write about the work of Lewis Henry Morgan around the time of his death in 1883. Engels described in The Origin of the Family pre-society, pre-class struggle period as primitive communism. So today we can use the less Eurocentric term primary communism. So according to anthropologists, this period is made up over 99% of human history. So what can this history before society, before class struggle teach us about human nature and the potential for the revolutionary transformation of society today? So Lewis Henry Morgan was the first to identify the political economy of the pre-class period as primitive communism. That's the term that Engels took from Morgan. So Morgan was a profound influence on Marx and Engels' theoretical and anthropological thought. Engels wrote in the preface to the first edition of The Origin of the Family in 1884, for Morgan, in his own way, had discovered afresh in America the materialist conception of history discovered by Marx 40 years ago. And in his comparison of barbarism and civilization, it had led him in the main points to some of the conclusions as Marx. And just as the professional economists in Germany were for years as busy in plagiarizing capital as they were persistent in attempting to kill it by silence, so Morgan's ancient society receives precisely the same treatment from the spokesman of prehistoric science in England. Much later, socialists such as Sam Marcy, founder of the Communist Workers' World Party, would use the less pejorative term primary communism. Marcy wrote in 1992, Lewis Henry Morgan's writings on communal life of the Iroquois in North America confirmed that the socialist movement in Europe had deduced about confirm what the socialist movement in Europe had deduced about early societies elsewhere before written history, that there was a universal period when property was communal, there was no state, and the products of human labor were shared equitably. In 1851, Morgan published League of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, which became a founding text of ethnography, the scientific study of cultural customs. Morgan's discovered that the Haudenosaunee had practiced communism in living for centuries. Haudenosaunee society planned for and met the needs of each individual. Extended families lived communally in large longhouses and shared their belongings in common. They organized intercommunal trade networks based on reciprocity. In 1881, Morgan wrote, among the Iroquois, hospitality was an established usage. If a man entered an Indian house in any of their villages, whether a villager, a tribesman, or a stranger, it was the duty of the women therein to set food before him. An omission to do this would have been discourtesy amounting to an affront. If hungry, he ate. If not hungry, courtesy required that he should taste the food and thank the giver. That would be repeated at every house he entered and at whatever hour of the day. So hospitality and harmony were key values in Haudenosaunee society. Engels explained the conditions that made such primary communism possible. A division of the tribe or the gens into different classes was equally impossible, and that brings us to the examination of the economic basis of these conditions. The population is extremely sparse. It is dense only at the tribe's place of settlement, around which lie in a wide circle first the hunting grounds, then the protective belt of neutral forest, which separates the tribe from others. The division of labor is purely primitive between the sexes only. The man fights in the wars, goes hunting and fishing, procures the raw materials of food and the tools necessary to do so. The woman looks after the house and the preparation of food, clothing, cooks, weaves, sews. They are each master in their own sphere, the man in the forest, the woman in the house. Each is owner of the instruments which he or she makes and uses, the man of the weapons, the hunting and fishing implements, the woman of the household gear. The housekeeping is communal among several and often many families. What is made and used in common is common property, the house, the garden, the longboat. So key to Engels' interpretation of Morgan was Morgan's discovery of matrilineal society, where the family lineage is traced through the female line. That means if a man marries a woman, he takes her mother's name. So Sam Marcy explained, primary communism based on food gathering and hunting succumbed to private ownership because it lacked the necessary concentration and development of the means of production. But private property, while more productive, also brought subjugation and degradation first of women. So the overthrow of matrilineal society signaled the beginning of inequality and class society, according to Engels. The overthrow of the mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home. Also, the woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. Engels saw Morgan's discovery as so key to understanding the origins of inequality that he wrote in the preface of the 1884 fourth edition to Origin of the Family, this rediscovery of the primitive matriarchal gens as the earlier stage of the patriarchal gens of civilized people has the same importance for anthropology as Darwin's theory of evolution has for biology and Marx's theory of surplus value has for political economy. It enabled Morgan to outline for the first time a history of the family in which, for the present, so far as the material now available permits, at least, the classic stages of development and their main outlines are now determined. So Engels considered Morgan's work to be as groundbreaking as Darwin, and indeed many of Engels' conclusions in The Origin of the Family were as influenced by Darwin's theories as they were by Morgan's. Now, when Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species was first published in 1859, it caused a sensation in the academic world. Scientists, biologists, and philosophers interpreted Darwin's evolutionary model in different ways. Social Darwinism was the belief that the strong survive through natural selection, and that this idea should be applied to humankind as much as Darwin applied it to the rest of nature. Social Darwinism came to dominate North American social theory in the 1870s. Social Darwinism, it really had little to do with Darwin. In fact, the conservative Anglican Thomas Robert Malthus's essays on population established the idea that on the whole, the best live, an idea which influenced Darwin's concept of natural selection. It was social Darwinist Herbert Spencer that actually coined the term survival of the fittest. Social Darwinists argued that society was rightly dominated by the powerful because they were the best of society. They argued that competition was the rule of success, not cooperation. Social Darwinism had been used to justify eugenics, imperialism, capitalism, and eventually fascism. However, others combined Darwin's theory of evolution with other kinds of evidence from zoology and anthropology and derived very different conclusions. Russian anarchist, zoologist, and theorist Peter Kropotkin argued in 1902 that mutual aid or reciprocal exchange for mutual benefit, not competition and violence, was a key factor for evolutionary success. Kropotkin wrote, as soon as we study animals, not in laboratories and museums only, but in the forest and in the prairie, in the steppe and in the mountains, we at once perceive that there is an immense amount of warfare and extermination amongst and amidst various species, and especially amidst various classes of animals. There is at the same time as much or perhaps even more of mutual support, mutual aid, and mutual defense amidst animals belonging to the same species or at least the same society. So Kropotkin listed many examples of intra and interspecies mutual aid in the animal world, and he concluded the animal species in which individual struggle has been reduced to the narrowest limits and the practice of mutual aid has attained the greatest development are invariably the most numerous and most prosperous and the most open to further progress. He cited a study done by Russian zoologist Karl Kessler, who concluded that all classes of animals, especially the higher ones, practice mutual aid using empirical evidence collected from burying beetles, birds, and mammalia. Humans were no exception. Kropotkin concluded, it is evidence that it would be quite contrary to all that we know of nature if men were an exception to so general a rule. If a creature so defenseless as man at his beginning should have his protection and his way to progress, not in mutual support like other animals, but in reckless competition for personal advantages with no regard to the interests of the species. Although leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, and Kropotkin disagreed on tactics, the two agreed that communism was the right course for humankind. Kropotkin said upon meeting Lenin, "How glad I am to see you, Vladimir Ilyich. You and I have different views. We have different." What's that?
Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov.
Well, yeah, Kropotkin just said the first two, Vladimir Ilyich. So that was Kropotkin, not me. Points of view about a whole series of problems, both as far as the execution and organization is concerned, but our goals are the same. And what you and your comrades are doing in the name of communism pleases me very much and makes my already aging heart happy. So Lenin was so impressed by Kropotkin's work that he approved a state funeral in Moscow for Kropotkin in 1921 and allowed anarchists to march and even carry anti-Bolshevik banners. Recent research has proven Kropotkin's statement to be true, that the earliest of human ancestors, anthropologist Tim White, Jen Sua, and Berhane Asfaw discovered the Ardipithecus ramidus, one of the earliest human ancestors not shared with chimpanzees, in the Afar region of Ethiopia in 1994. Their discovery was dated to about 4.5 million years ago. The discovery of the Ardipithecus ramidus shed light on the trajectory of human evolution when compared with one of our closest relatives, the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee's teeth have what is called a honing complex, which means they have long canines that are used to rip apart tough meats. Homo sapiens and Ardipithecus ramidus do not have a honing complex. The canines of Ardipithecus ramidus are significantly feminized, meaning they are not sexually dimorphic. Sexual dimorphism is when species develop traits specific to the male or female sex. Smaller canines indicate that Ardipithecus ramidus likely exhibited significantly less male-to-male aggression when compared with primates like chimpanzees. A lesser degree of sexual dimorphism could also mean a greater amount of equality between the sexes. Sue and the others write, the dental evidence leads to the hypothesis that the last common ancestors of African apes and hominids were characterized by relatively low levels of canine, post-canine, and body size dimorphism. These were probably the anatomical correlates of comparatively weak amounts of male-male aggression, perhaps associated with male philanthropy and a tendency for male-female co-dominance, as seen in Pampeniscus and 8-line species. This evidence indicated that the earlier work of primatologists like Jay Gould, who tried to make inferences about human nature from studies with chimpanzees and other aggressive ape species, was less relevant to human nature, since decreased aggression seems to be what set the human line apart from the other apes. The human evolutionary line appears to indicate that parental investment, cooperation, and gender equality, not competition and violence, were at least partially responsible for the evolutionary adaptations, like upright walking and larger brain size, that contributed to the formation of more complex modern Homo sapiens. I have more. I was going to go into gift economy and all that, but I think my time is up. Do you want me to just hold it here and then I might be able to
finish if you like. I think that the gift economy stuff gets us into a very interesting terrain. So you're free to finish if you want.
All right. Yeah. I'll just go ahead then and go through all of it. Then I just have a little bit more here. So the anthropologist Alfred Radcliffe Brown applied Kropotkin's concept of mutual aid to his ethnological and ethnographic work in the 1930s. He said of Kropotkin's influence, like other young men with blood in their veins, I wanted to do something to reform the world, to get rid of poverty and war and so on. So I read Godwin, Proudhon, Marx, and innumerable others. Kropotkin, revolutionary but still a scientist, pointed out how important for any attempt to improve society was a scientific understanding of it. Radcliffe Brown proposed that the primary factor in the maintenance of society is not governmental pressure, but social pressure. He wrote, a social relation does not result from a similarity of interest, but rests on the mutual interests of persons in one another, or on one or more common interests, or a combination of both of these. What is called conscience is thus, in the widest sense, the reflex of in the individual of the sanctions of society. Radcliffe Brown acknowledges Kropotkin did that cooperation and mutual aid drove social evolution through collective responsibility, not coercive force. Other anthropologists have suggested the origins of trade and material exchange were not the result of greed and competition either, but the result of the law of reciprocity. Reciprocity is mutually beneficial exchange without immediate reward. It's also known as gift economy. The French anthropologist Marcel Mauss wrote on gift-giving economy in his book, The Gift, Forms and Functions of Exchange in Archaic Societies. In it, he wrote, in Scandinavian civilization and in a good number of others, exchanges and contracts take place in the form of presents. In theory, these are voluntary. In reality, they're given and reciprocated obligatorily. He described the process of gift giving as potlatch, using the North American Chinook term. Anthropologist Franz Boas demonstrated the meaning of potlatch by quoting Chief Awaxalagalus of the Kwagule of British Columbia in his for his 1888 article, The Indians of British Columbia. We will dance when our laws command us to dance. We will feast when our hearts desire to feast. We ask the white man do as the Indian does? No, we do not. Why then will you ask us do as the white man does? It is a strict law that bids us to dance. It is a strict law that bids us to distribute our property among our friends and neighbors. It is a good law. Let the white man observe his law, we shall observe ours. And now, if you are come to forbid us to dance, be gone. If not, you will be welcome to us. Mauss describes the potlatch tradition as universal among archaic societies. In the Maori culture of New Zealand, for example, all goods possess a spiritual power that is exchanged along with the gift. The spiritual power is called the hau, and the physical gift is called tonga. Maori judicial expert explained it best in Mauss's book. The tonga and all gods termed strictly personal excuse me, let me start over. The tonga and all gods termed strictly personal possess a hau, a spiritual power. You give me one of them and I pass it on to a third party. He gives me another in turn because he is impelled to do so by the hau my present possesses. I, for my part, am obliged to give you that thing because I must return to you what is in reality the effect of the hau of your tonga. This system of reciprocity was a form of exchange that predated both barter, direct trade, and mercantile trade for currency exchange. In his conclusion, Mauss was optimistic about the elevation of the social over the individual. He wrote, "The brutish pursuit of individual ends is harmful to the ends of and the peace of all, to the rhythm of their work and joys, and rebounds on the individual himself." He then critiqued capitalism, saying that under the contemporary system, men are turned into machines, forced to exchange their labor for less than its true value. He argued that the workers of all societies and historical epochs expected to be fairly rewarded for their efforts, and that the individualistic type of economy did not do this. He stated there was a self-interest in gift giving, but it was only self-interest in the sense that what is good for the whole is good for the individual. I think I'm gonna skip this part about class race and Gramsci. Here I'll just skip to the part about Salins. So anthropologist Marshall Salins argued in his book Stone Age Economics, published in 1972, that while industrial society attempted to achieve affluence through producing much, primary communist society actually achieved affluence through desiring little. Salins based his claims on data from two contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, the Arnhem Landers of Australia and the Dobie Bushmen of the Kalahari, Africa. His most surprising claim was that the average amount of time spent in procuring food for these primary communists was about 4 to 5 hours a day. The rest of their time was spent in leisure and sleep activities. Despite problems with Salin's original data and conclusions, his theory of original affluence turned hunter-gatherer society from a painful life of toil to an enviable, easy life of leisure and affluence in anthropological discourse. Data from anthropologists suggest the opposite of the social Darwinist and objectivist claim that human nature is essentially greedy. In fact, the research of anthropologists reveals that the vast majority of human history was stateless, egalitarian, and communal. Mutual aid, reciprocity, and communal kinship bonds, not greed, competition, and violence, prompted the first leaps in human evolution. If humanity had communism for most of its history, we can have communism again. According to Sam Marcy, the discovery of early communist societies refuted the canard assiduously cultivated by apologists of the bourgeoisie, that a planned society is utopian, that humankind cannot plan its own society on the basis of common ownership of the means of production and equitable distribution of the products of labor. People had done just that for hundreds of thousands of years, and actually more like millions of years.
Thank you, Mitch. Great job. And Comrade Charles.
Thank you. Greetings to Midwest Marx, Carlos Garrida, Carla Winchell, Professor Thomas Riggins, and Mitchell Jones. I would like to make some observations on the revolutionary and humanitarian heroic revolutionary and humanitarian Frederick Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. I'll start with talking about the terms in the title. Family. The family discussed here is a male supremacist family. Engels describes the overthrow of mother right, referred to earlier by Mr. Jones, and this is in Greek society. Mother right is defined as Mr. Jones did, tracing descent through the female line, and quoting specifically the same quote referred to earlier from the origin. The overthrow of mother right was the world historic defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. Women were degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. This degraded position of the woman is especially conspicuous among the Greeks of the heroic and still more of the classical age, has gradually been palliated and glossed over, and sometimes clothed in a milder form. In no sense has it been abolished. So I always refer to this book as the origin of the male supremacist family, private property in the state. Now, in the preface to OFPPS, preface to the first edition, Engels also says, quote, according to the materialistic conception, the determining factor in history is in the final instance, the production and reproduction of immediate life. This is, again, is a twofold character. On the one side, the production of the means of existence of food and clothing and shelter and the tools necessary for the production. And on the other side, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. And I ask again, there was always just one side to it earlier on, so, but I'm glad that Comrade Engels, I think after studying anthropology and probably after a life of more experience with women, includes reproduction with production. My paper, I have a paper for women's liberation, comradely critique of the manifesto of the Communist Party, which goes into this in detail. Now, next, I would like to discuss the terms private property and the state in the title. Marxists see the ending of private property in the state in communist society, the kingdom of freedom. And the manifesto, quote, on private property is that the theory of the, quote, the theory of communists can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. Brief lawyerly statement on property there as to what the goal of communism is. Then the state, another term in the title, withers away in classless society. You know, I learned that in reading State and Revolution. I think it's also in this book, but I couldn't find it this time. But anyway, you know, our goal is to end war, world peace. No more standing bodies of armed men who fight wars, you know, armed personnel. So the term family in the title has male supremacy, and that's to be overcome. You know, we're ending and overcoming the private property in the state. Also, no doubt, the male supremacist family must become overcome. Now, in the manifesto, there's a lot of discussion, abolition of prostitution, especially by the bourgeoisie. That is both in sharing their wives in common and in prostitution outside of their family. Okay, so in 145, in my edition, international edition of the Origin, Engels discusses the fact we have a negation, we have an overcoming of male supremacy in the family. But then Engels wisely says, what we can now conjecture about the way in which sexual relations will be ordered after the impending overthrow of capitalist production is mainly of a negative character, limited for the most part to what will disappear. But what will there be new? That will be answered when a new generation has grown up, a generation of men and women who never in their lives have known what is to buy a woman's surrender with, men surrender with money or any social instrument of power. A generation of women who have never known what it is to give themselves to a man from any other considerations than real love, or refuse to give themselves to their lover from fear of the economic consequences, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a speculation about how we're going to revolutionize the family. Next, I want to mention that after writing The Origin, Engels saw fit to put an anthropological footnote in the famous first sentence of the manifesto. Here, we all know the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggles. But Engels, after the writing and studying anthropology, has the history of all hitherto existing society asterisk that says that is all written's history. In 1847, the prehistory of society, the social organization, existing patterns of recorded history was all but unknown. Since then, there has hacks a thousand discovered common ownership of land in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. Let's skip down here. Engels says, I have attempted to retrace the process of dissolution of the primitive, wrong word, Stone Age society in The Origin, the book The Origin. Now, of course, there were no antagonistic classes in Stone Age society. So history was not a history of class struggles. It's pre-private property. And now we know that the Stone Age begins 2.5 million years ago with Homo habilis. But of course, there's no writing. And this issue, he labels it specifically. Now, where you say written history is a history of class struggles. And that's, correct in terms of modern anthropology, archaeology, because we find alphabetic writing originates with the state and private property in Mesopotamia around 6,000 years ago. Engels' book is on, Western civilization, origin of so-called civilization. So, but the Stone Age societies did have, very importantly, full language and symbolic communication, culture, tradition, cave paintings, and no doubt other picture writing. There was language, but not alphabetic writing. Now, the word origin, of course, implies that in the title that Engels is hypothesizing that the male supremacist family, private property, that is class struggle and greed, and the state did not exist before the origin. This origin that he discussed. So in other words, the Stone Age did not have these three institutions. The Stone Age was so-called primitive communism. And all evidence from European ethnohistory and ethnography of Stone Age societies in the last 500 years that the Europeans have burst out all over the globe corroborate this profound point in Engels' origin. And the footnote to the first sentence, corroborates the footnotes to the first sentence of the manifesto. I have a blog item on the big three, family, private property, state. And they are, in that I say, male supremacy, greed, war are not in our genes. The male supremacist family, private property, and antagonistic classes, greed, private property is antagonistic classes, greed, and the state, special repressive apparatus, standing bodies of armed personnel with prisons, etc., arises in a complex together around 6,000 years ago. I don't know if they had prisons sometimes in Mesopotamia. Mainly Engels' book again is about Greece and Rome. They are still together. Germany. They are still together in the complex that dominates the human species in 2022. Before that, for about 2.5 million years of the Stone Age, true civilization, there was a gender sex equivalence, sharing, and world peace in the species. That is when we were substantially hardwired genetically. So male supremacy and class divided society and war are not in our genes. They are not human nature. It's not human nature to go to war, kill each other, you know, steal, be greedy. This is very important because otherwise we'd have to do genetic engineering to get rid of those things. Okay, so I will end there.
Thank you, Comrade Charles. So now we want to go into the section of replying to one another's opening statements. So if we can go in the same order as we did our presentations. Comrade Tom, do you have any comments on the opening statements from Comrade Mitch and Charles?
They were both very interesting. But I have no, what can I say? They gave very thorough discussion of the origin of family, private property, and state. I thought we were supposed to just be talking about the Engels essay. And so I did not go and review my notes on all that information. A lot of it, however, is they didn't have a lot of real type of anthropology we do in the 20th century and the 19th century. And the knowledge that, except for Morgan, who did field work, most of the information that, and Engels basically rewrote all of this is really in Morgan, in ancient society. There are tribes, there are different tribes and groups of people. This idea of primitive communism is a universal thing. There are I think the Mundigamor is an example of people who are very selfish and nasty with each other. It did nothing but try to cheat each other all the time. And you couldn't get a more disgusting society than this Stone Age society that the Ruth Benedict visited. She was a student of Boas at Columbia. And so there were no classes in the old Stone Age. Classes began to develop in the Neolithic, and this is even before writing. There were civilizations that had architecture and building that didn't get writing. So a lot of the things that Engels thought were like sort of universal were true in some areas and not true in others, and there was a generalization about what we were like before the Egyptians started their hieroglyphs. Or if you're an Egyptologist, you want to say it was the Egyptians that started it. If you're a Mesopotamic person, then oh no, it was the Sumerians. And the Chinese, of course, seem to have done it independently, and the Maya did it. And so they're independent. Olmecs, for instance, had a civilization. We don't know if they had any writing.
Egypt.
Egypt.
India.
Egypt
and India.
Well, it didn't go into India, but they may have picked up their writing from an earlier civilization that is Sanskrit's language. The Inca didn't have writing. Aztecs had writing that I think they picked it up learned it from the Maya, but the Incas didn't seem to have they had an advanced civilization, but they didn't have writing. So that's a big limitation. So
Picture writing. They have picture writing.
They didn't have. I just think we can't universalize what it was like in the old Stone Age or the new Stone Age. In general, to talk about being able to build communism in the future because in primitive societies they had, in quote, communism. It's called primitive communism because in the Stone Age there were no means of production and distribution like we'd be talking about in advanced society. People made flints. They were hunter-gatherers. Some of them had spare time, and some of them didn't. Some of them actually really lived hand to mouth, and if they didn't have any leisure time at all. Some of the Indians in the lower parts of South America and the Digger Indians here in the United States, from whom the Aztecs, to whom Aztecs are related, by the way. The Kwakiutl were hunter-gatherers, but they happened to be in a good environment where they had salmon, and they could collect so much food and dry it that they actually had months of leisure time. And if you look at the Northwest Indian Kwakiutl society, that was a very advanced society. They had chiefdoms, they had slavery. In a hunting gathering society with slavery. Now that really is like, oh my gosh, Engels would have liked that. But
they didn't have slavery.
That spare time, they had slaves. If you study it, OS. The Kwakiutl they're the people with the totem poles. They had warfare. They had all the things when you have a lot of spare time is the devil's workshop. And so you can find all exceptions almost to all these different societies in different parts of the world.
Comrade Mitch, any comments?
Yeah, actually, that brought up something I was thinking about too when Charles was speaking, is that, you know, Marx and Engels came up with this model of, you know, primitive society, and then, you know, then you have like the beginnings of civilization, and you have slave society, and then, you know, and then you have the ancient Greeks and Romans, and then you have feudalism, and then you have capitalism, and then hopefully the next step is socialism, and then communism. But you know, one of the things that I was thinking is that Engels and Marx were looking at Europe as almost the height of history to that point, right? And so that's what's called a unilinear model of evolution. And I was going to say also, speaking of Tom, your comment that the Kwakiutl had slaves, I don't know about that, but I do know that the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, who Lewis Henry Morgan looked into, a lot of anthropologists now believe that they did in fact have cannibalism. So they had a tradition called the cannibal dance, and there was a lot of debate over whether this was a symbolic thing or not. But a lot of anthropologists now do think that they did practice cannibalism, and a lot of these civilizations were very warlike. The Yanomamo, who a lot of I can't remember now the name of the anthropologist that wrote about the Yanomamo, but they're a very warlike people in the Amazon.
The so-called fierce people, but that's a slander. He's been checked on that.
Mitch,
okay, yeah.
Mitch, I just want to, cannibalism is not universal, but I have friends every Sunday to go to church and practice cannibalism.
That's right, transubstantiation, yeah.
Body and blood of Christ, yeah.
Yes, and that if that is your belief, that it is the doctrine of transubstantiation is that it is literally turned into flesh and blood. So if that's your belief, then you believe that you are actually being a cannibal, right? So I don't know. It is
go to church. I'm saying vegans shouldn't be Catholic.
yeah, right. But I do think it is interesting that, so, you know, there have been sort of multilinear models of social evolution proposed and things that, and there's, you know, indigenous anthropology now is like kind of a rising field of like people doing anthropology, doing ethnography on like the groups that they are a part of. And so kind of you know, taking the Spivak thing, you know, that the subaltern can speak in this way. So that's kind of an emerging field in anthropology as well. And then not not using, you know, what are considered Eurocentric models. And this unilinear model is considered sort of a Eurocentric model in today's. But I do think, despite these exceptions, despite, you know, a lot of things, I do think there are certain universals that you can point to. And I don't think Morgan and Marx and Engels were too far off as far as that goes.
Yeah, on that point, Marx had a category of Oriental despotism, which was not, you know, in the Far East. It was different than the model
The
of
Asiatic
slave feudal. You know, he had a different. So it wasn't they were not proposing a universal model.
Yeah, the Asiatic
I mean,
mode of
the one in
production
the
that was,
manifesto or whatever is not the universal model.
I wanted to comment on one other thing too, in terms of the evidence that was available at the time. Tom mentioned Neanderthals, and Neanderthals were first discovered in 1829. But science since then has evolved to an understanding that Neanderthals probably weren't part of the line that led to humans. They were an evolutionary spandrel that died off. And so that's something too, is that, you know, scientists at the time may have looked at the existence of Neanderthals and said, well, this is the missing link, when it's actually not. Scientists today don't really see it as a link.
I have to disagree with that point. I have to disagree with that because recently they found Neanderthal DNA in living populations. That can only occur if Neanderthals are the same species. They're Homo sapiens. And back when I was in school, there was a debate as to whether they were, you know, Homo sapiens, because their brain they have average brain size larger than we do. But now it's pretty much confirmed with the with the DNA in living Homo sapiens. That cannot happen unless there was a Neanderthal and a Homo sapien were able to mate and produce fertile offspring, which means they are the same species. If I might disagree on that. You know, on the just a small point on Dr. Riggins' meat, Engels, and the meat in the diet, etc. What I notice in teaching, you know, is that one of the patterns is, of course, in human evolution is from Homo habilis through Homo sapien or through Neanderthal, increasing brain size and shrinking teeth size. So, cooking food allowed a evolution of smaller teeth. You know, big teeth are necessary when you're doing a lot of chewing, when you're raw meat, and also a lot of vegetables. So smaller teeth leaves more room in the skull for a bigger brain. So it's kind of like a co-evolution of decreasing the ability to control fire, cook your meat, don't have to chew it as much, so therefore you don't have to have as big teeth. Is a kind of a co-evolution of the larger brain size. In general, the larger brain size, I would say, is due to greater skills in courting. I have articles on that, but the ultimate test in Darwinism is population growth. Differential fertility is more important than differential mortality in determining fitness. So mating, anything increases fertile matings is the most powerful determinant of. So why is this brain getting bigger? You could say it's because you're a better fighter. Probably not, because the hunting and defending are communal, as we discussed earlier. So any bigger brains, smarter individuals' skill in fighting goes to the group, the other fighters, whereas my hypothesis is that it's in improves courting skills that the larger brain is selected for.
That's a good point. That made me think of something that if you have a society that is constantly fighting and killing each other, you're not going to survive very well in evolution. I mean, that's an evolutionary law that in which case a greater amount of violence and competition would do you harm evolutionarily, because
Definitely.
more members of the
less
species
fit.
would be dying before they're able to mate.
Right. No other species does. Lions don't kill lions, except for no other species. They don't fight internally because they would be selected against. Humans, humans increase their internal harmony even over the primates that we evolved out of. Basically, Homo habilis follows Ardipithecus. Ardipithecus is bipedal, has hands, but doesn't have cultures. That's why Engels, that undercuts Engels' argument in the transition from ape to man, so-called humans, ape to humans. But the Homo habilis, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm making two observations. Animals are, not all animals are nice like that. Lions, as a matter of fact, male lions, when they chase off a pride leader, will kill all the baby lions in that pride so that the female lions will reproduce and the cubs will be his. So there's a lot of nasty stuff going on with our animal friends. And two,
I think that's rare.
I think, well, I just appeal to Nova, the guy with the camera.
Yeah, Nova.
He's got pictures of it. I don't know how rare it is. I think if you look at the scientific terminology that was in use a few years ago for describing our species, we are referred to as Homo sapiens sapiens.
Correct.
And the Neanderthals are referred to as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. So
subspecies.
They are subspecies of Homo sapien, as are we. So they got promoted from being Homo neanderthalensis to Homo sapiens neanderthalensis.
Truly. A race. It's like a race.
I had one question that I wanted to put up to the panelists, which is that so Mitch, one of the things that you emphasized in your speech was that I think one of the quotes that you mentioned was that 99% of human history we have been living in communistic forms of societies. We know, as the panel prompt said, that towards the last 2 to 3 years of Marx's life, he was studying a lot of ethnography and anthropology precisely for these reasons, because there are still communities around the world that live according to what might be called primary communistic sort of forms of life. The question I want to ask is, what benefit does that bring what benefit does knowledge of that bring the struggle for socialism, and how can you avoid like the idealistic and I would say even at times utopian tendency that comes about when one is aware of that and takes almost the reactionary position that all we have to do is like negate the last 500 years of the development of capital and go back to this. So how can you understand those developments in a way that's progressive, that incorporates what I think are genuinely liberating potentials that the expansion of the means of production has brought about? How can you combine those two things?
Yeah, you can't put the toothpaste back in the bottle, and you can't put can't put the genie back in the bottle, and you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And there is the not to too much trash another left-wing position, but the so-called green anarchist primitivist idea, it is really reactionary by definition, because it wants to go back to a different era where there were way, way, way fewer people, and anybody that's serious about an anarcho-primitivist program, then they either support genocide or have no idea how you would actually implement something like that. So what we want to get to, and I do think that unilinear model is a good model. And you had slave society, you had feudal society, you had capitalism, and the relationships of oppressor to oppressed changed. They became increasingly or they became complex at some times, and then simpler at other times. Became sort of warped by different theories that came around, race, and things like that. So these relationships of oppressor to oppressed, it's that in some ways it did get simpler with it being bourgeoisie and proletarian, but there's other elements as well with with race and gender and all that kind of stuff. But the extrapolating that model, and I guess we don't really have to extrapolate it. We do have examples. We don't have examples of modern day communism, but we have examples of states that have become worker states and have gone to that next evolutionary level and have replaced the capitalist mode of production with a socialist mode of production. And the goal of the socialist mode of production is to get to communism, in a way where we can still, support billions of people on Earth and have an industrial society and have all the nice things that we like about modernization.
I think we have a terminological issue here. Socialism is a lower stage of communism. So if you have socialism, you have a lower stage of communism. Communism is the highest stage of socialism. I would say I don't even know if we had worker states. We had non-capitalist states because at least they weren't private. Capitalism was not at work. I used to think the Soviet Union was in the socialist state. That is, it was at the lower level of communism. And it would, if it democratized, it could approach real communism, but not as long as the imperialist world was around. So it's like, pie in the sky. But the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European makes me wonder if they had even the lower stage of socialism. Because if they had or even if they had a worker state, if the workers were the ruling class, the workers wouldn't destroy their own state, and they wouldn't sit around on their arses while somebody else destroyed the state. And the Red Army is supposed to be made up of proletarian, the children of proletarian. The working classes did not come out to support any of those so-called socialist states in the East. So I think that there's a real problem on whether we can get to whether we should be calling them socialist or even working states. Observation though on the primitive, what we would call now primary communist states. The tribal groups in New Guinea are definitely something that we would, if we have got a time machine, we would expect to find Stone Age people at. And they have wars. They have headhunting. They have all sorts of rivalries going on. So I think a lot of the ideas I like the origin of private property and state, but a lot of that is a little mixture of some utopianism in there. But I think it's just because they didn't have enough ethnological data. It was only in the 20th century that all African tribes and the Aboriginal tribes, they've all been mapped practically. There are still some uncontacted people in Brazil, but the current state of Brazil is that they will probably be exterminated by our civilization before the end of this century.
You know, on the earlier point, when I was in law school, I went on a summer project to Northwest California, the Yurok indigenous peoples on land recovery. The focus of many indigenous peoples is land recovery because land is so central to their culture. And at that time, and I was both anthropology, student, and also in law school. And, I certainly had I certainly had the conclusion that Stone Age society is civilization, and class divided society is barbarism. That's what I teach my students in my anthropology class. However, it's on the earlier point, it's unrealistic. I mean, it's not going to happen that somehow, that the indigenous peoples would be, I mean, there have been some successes in land recovery, but, this issue of they wouldn't want to return at this point to full, thousands of years ago society. But I think that in the future, when the state withers away, when we abolish private property and the state withers away, we're in the kingdom of freedom. I think sections of the earth can be, some kind of combination. They might have steel, but they don't, the metal steel as opposed to stones, but they have kinship as the center of their society. I mean, that's the key, is organizing society centered on kinship, et cetera. No state, et cetera. I think it's possible that we could have, again, some areas of Earth would be at different stages of human history. And so, in some areas, you would have Stone Age organization combined with some modern, technology. And I don't think that's not utopian. That is scientific.
I wanted to follow up on I think there was a point made talking about sort of the relationship between writing, written history, and maybe capital, and how the early societies, which, as we've discussed, could be really deeply satisfying to people's needs, didn't really have that. And so I'm curious, it seems to me there's some kind of relationship. I know like the earliest tablets we have, Sumerian tablets, are records of debt and things like that. And so is written history itself in some ways individualizing, do you guys think? Or what's the relationship there? Why don't we have written history of civilizations that we know were deeply fulfilling? I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts on that.
I was going to say,
oh, go
ahead.
Yeah, for one thing, notice that superstructure writing came out of the economic base. First writing is like money or checks or something like that. It's in commodity exchange. Is one point that I always notice. But go ahead.
I was going to say, I forget now kind of the list that we went through, but when you were talking about, when Tom, you were talking about societies that had writing, and you talked about Egypt and
This is
Sumeria.
alphabetic
And,
writing, by the way. Alphabetic. There's
okay.
picture writing before that. Egypt has both. And by the way, I've reviewed picture writing from the Aztec picture writing codices. I'm pretty sure that the Incas had picture writing too.
So
we're talking about alphabetic. This is the origin of alphabetic writing.
Even
you got picture
those
writing in caves in South America. They're finding huge caves all over. They're finding more and more picture writing. There may be some alphabetic writing in there.
Egyptians had an alphabet, but they didn't use it. They used their hieroglyphs are a mixture of symbols, what they call ideograms, pictures of the sun, sunshine. But they didn't Egyptologists have got an alphabet that they used for consonants, but they didn't actually write their literature in using an alphabet.
So
Phoenicians are the first ones we know that actually use an alphabet.
What do you call it? It's the Mesopotamians, Assyrians.
But they used cuneiform. That was.
It was alphabetic.
Well,
they had alphabetic writing.
They did not use an alphabet in their writing, though. They had.
So my point is,
they had signs for the noises we make: E, I, O, U, F. They had symbols for those signs.
Right.
And also had symbols.
Letters. They have letters.
Yes, but they didn't
use alphabetic. Alphabetic is a combination of letters for a word.
Yes, and they did not do that in their writing. What they did was a combination of those symbols for that we call letters, the A, E, I, O, the consonant signs, and our vowels. They had one hieroglyphic for those. Then they had hieroglyphics for abstract ideas. They had ideas for symbols, and they mixed them all together.
Like Chinese.
So let's think about this data, because the point I was trying to get at was, do you think, because it seems to me that the earliest writing was done in the states that we might consider the first, or was done in the societies that we might consider the first state societies?
Definitely. Religion. There's an elite class of mental laborers. It's the origin of the distinction between mental and physical laborers. The ancient antagonism of mental and physical laborers. The ruling class, has these priests with writing. The slaves can't read or write, or most of the people can't read or write. And then, it's also the origin of religion, gods. Stone Age people have ancestor veneration, not worship, in my opinion.
Yeah, the earliest writing the earliest hieroglyphs and in the Sumerian writing seems to have been economic in the sense that taxes are being paid, and these symbols were up for symbols for wheat, symbols for grains, and for animals like sheep and cows and goats, and you find these are markings of like
commodities. They're exchanging commodities.
Like
it's
5
like
sheep or
labor theory of value. So many sheep for so many. It's the origin of commodity production, and the recording of it, which is base, determines the origin of the superstructure of writing, alphabetic writing. That was it.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the earliest states had to have a surplus to maintain the not the army, but police force and the dikes to keep the agriculture for the peasants, and they had to pay into a central area these extra crops and sheep and eggs and chickens to feed the class of people who are going to turn into a ruling class. And so the writing was to record that, how many eggs, how many sheep, blah, blah, blah. And from that, people got the idea that you could do some abstract thinking, and you begin slowly to get literature, and finally you get this full-fledged written language where you can express any idea you want in it.
They got abstract thinking when they're making the first stone tools. That's abstract thinking. Abstract thinking begins with language. When those stone tools that Homo habilis have indicate that they have abstract thinking.
We're talking about writing it down, being able to pass it on to the next generation.
Right. It's probably, first of all, it's not speech. It's probably dance, music, drums. The language is in those forms, but they can, that's the key thing. They pass it on down through the generations. When they invented how to make those stone tools, the technique is passed on. That's what culture gives us the ability to do, symbolic communication. When they invent how to control fire, Homo erectus, they pass it on. By the way, a funny thing on the origin of control of fire, Prometheus in the Greek myth stole fire from the gods and he was punished for it. But notice, were the Greek gods correct? Here we are, we're burned so much, we have climate change. Maybe Greek gods knew that if we took fire, we were going to burn too much of it.
I have just a question.
That's a joke.
I have a question to bring it back to the arena of social formation and really what we call the materialist theory of history, historical materialism, which is that, Mitch, one of the topics that you brought up was the unilateral theory of history. And this appears very clearly early on in the works of Marx. It appears in the manifesto published, but also in posthumously published works such as the German Ideology. There's a very clear unilateral theory of history, and which is restated quite explicitly in the tradition of the Third International. Now, one of the more unexplored areas or epochs of Marx's life has been those last few years where he turns his attention to anthropology and ethnography. And he started to develop, through his studies of primary communities, a multilinear understanding of history, a sort of the application of the principles that allowed for historical materialism in an understanding of the historical formations in Europe, were basically applied elsewhere and realized that some places didn't require the same steps or didn't even have certain steps that we consider to be essential in the development. I think there's 5 primary ones: slave, feudal, capitalist, socialist, communist. And so there was already in the late Marx a shift towards a multilinear theory of history that was not ever really published. But now what we have in a recent publication, and just to note on that last topic, there's an interesting letter for I think the viewers should check out on that was written to a Russian revolutionary, Vera Sasulich. And this is written, I believe, in 1881. She's asking Marx whether Russia needs to go through the period of capitalism in order to achieve socialism, that a lot of the Marxists in Russia are arguing that that's what needs to be done. And he writes 4 letter responses to her, one that's really, really long, like 40-ish pages, and he scraps that, and he does one that's like 20 something, and he ends up sending one that's like a couple pages long. And there he says, look, the unilateral theory of history that I talk about in Capital, it's specific to my studies of Western Europe. From the studies that I've been able to do of Russia, it seems like you have the communities and the social relations that already have the conditions for the possibility of socialism once they engage with the natural expansion of capital to Russia. So that's that. But I wanted to bring it back to a recent book that was published and that has gotten quite a bit of popularity from David Graeber, and I forget who the co-author is. I didn't write it down, but the book is called The Dawn of Everything. And it's got an audacious name, and it makes some audacious comments, right? We understand in Western philosophy, there was this understanding that there was, at some point in history, something came about, and we started having social formations that were unequal. So for Rousseau, famously, this is with the introduction of property. This is a thesis that seems to be recaptured in Marxism in the way we analyze these primary communist communities. At some point, something is introduced. Engels, in The Origins of the Family, Private Property and State, that first thing that's introduced is the monogamous family that allows for social inequality. But one of the points that Graeber's making in his book, and it has been disputed by quite a few different Marxist websites, is that there is no time before inequality. We have sporadic periods of social equality in certain areas and sporadic periods of inequality in certain other areas. That we have periods of chaos, of warring, and even of the formations of states that come about and then dissolve themselves quite sporadically. And that what makes humans unique in the way they form themselves into society is the ability that they have to be creative and pragmatic and be able to develop new ways of relating to one another at the social realm. And that the problem that we've had is that we've been stuck in over the last few centuries in the way that we engage in our social relations. Now, this thesis has been disputed by a few different Marxist projects, Climate and Capitalism, which is, I think, an eco-socialist project of Monthly Review. They did a few replies to it. They were quite good. But what would you say your general reaction to Graeber's thesis would be? And does it present a threat to the way we think about historical materialism?
I'd say Graeber's wrong. There definitely has been equality, for most of the time. And Graeber was a Solon student too. I don't know if you know that. But, I just flat out, there's, it's just there's just too much evidence of the egalitarian and sex, equivalence of Stone Age societies. It's just, I don't know why he did it, but I think he's just flat out wrong. The evidence contradicts him all over the place. Indigenous Americans, had egalitarian societies.
I think sometimes the term primary communism or primitive communism seems a little bit utopian. And it's important for us to remember that these societies weren't utopias. And, contrary to Salen's thesis that the food quest was only 4 or 5 hours a day, he didn't factor in, the time it took to prepare the food and, all the other tasks that go into, procuring and sustaining yourself. So I think more than maybe seeing it as a universal rule, I think seeing it as a principle of a stage of development where that was not a utopia, but it was it did lack certain characteristics that we're used to in modern society, like class struggle and gender power imbalance and things like that. So I think that is a good lesson for us to take, that it has been done and it can be done where you have a stateless egalitarian society, right? So that's important for us to remember, and that it has been done not only at a certain time, but it was very widespread, very much widespread. And I think now, you know, a lot of those anthropologists, they did their field work in the 60s and 70s, and, you know, the Trobriand Islands and Papua New Guinea and you know, the Amazon rainforests and places like that, the Kalahari Desert, you know, there was this idea that there were these pristine cultures that were untouched by the outside world. You know, it wasn't even really true then, and it's especially not true now of those same cultures. And in a way, you know, what's his name, Fukuyama, you know, when he said that liberalism was the end of history, well, it was the end of the history of a lot of other, it certainly destroyed a lot of other alternative histories. So I think that, you know, with the neoliberal system, it's been such a cancer on the rest of the world that maybe Marx, you know, his original thesis that you have to go through capitalism to get to socialism maybe is right now, you know, at this stage in development, but maybe it was possible, you know, at earlier stages to not do that. And I think that was a very interesting comment about Russia, because oftentimes what people say is that, you know, Russia and China didn't go through capitalism. They still were basically feudal when they had their revolution. So that's a really interesting comment.
Dr. Riggins, any comments on that?
I think most of our history of our species has been solitary, mean, nasty, and short.
Hobbes.
Civilization.
Yeah, we Solomons have the exact opposite opinion on that. But also, it was, I would say it's pretty clear that they did not have private property. So therefore, you know, lack of private property is definitely a form of communism. You know,
I
it's just
don't know what that means in the Stone Age. I said it, I made this flint so I can go get me a cave bear out of the cave so I can go in there with my woman and live. I'm not sharing that flint with somebody else. You can go make
wrong. They share, you know, they were sharing everything. Plus, they don't go solid individually.
It's all hypothetical. We don't know what they were doing. We don't have enough archaeological evidence. We have
we do.
Flints.
And plus, we got evidence of, you know, indigenous Americans. But also, they don't go as individuals; they go as a group. It's definitely
by contact. So we
have hunt in groups.
We have no idea.
Yeah, we do.
They lived in clans.
we got a good idea.
Society is itself a development. There are people that have not even evolved in the clan society. There are people who are still living in bands. So all this is hypothetical. We have no idea how people lived in the old Stone Age, and we have no written records. We have cave paintings. We project our own cultural values onto those cave paintings. We don't know whether they were there for magic. We don't know whether they were there because somebody just felt artistic. We don't know if they were there for religious purposes, or I can draw a better bear than you, bigger. Who knows what they were doing in there? We just guess.
Well, then we can never really know anything. Then, if
we can never know anything.
Yeah, we know we got a lot of evidence.
You can read the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
It's called the comparative method. In anthropology, we call it the comparative method, by which we make inferences regarding the early Stone Age from existing Stone Age societies.
You do make those.
Yeah, we got evidence.
That's not evidence. That's inference.
Yeah, it is evidence.
Well, it's not what I learned when I studied anthropology. My anthropologist told me that these are inferences that we make, but the contemporary Stone Age societies that we meet have traveled down the same 5,000 or 6,000 years that we traveled down. We are 6,000 years away from ancient Egypt and the beginnings of Western civilization, 3,000 or 4,000 years from Greece. These Indians in Australia are 10,000 years away from the settlers that came there, their original settlers. They've had all sorts of things going on. For us to make inferences back is just the best guess that you can make. And that's why you have different schools of anthropology. That's why the 19th century anthropologists, early 20th century anthropologists don't like them. Modern contemporary anthropologists are jumping on the people in the 30s. Oh, you're wrong. Then we have the diffusionist school. We have evolutionary school. We have the functional school.
Yeah,
All
anthropology is theoretic.
with each other.
Anthropology is theoretically anarchistic.
So until we can,
copying the people, they don't have people who don't have a state.
until we develop a time
we're
machine,
anarchists, theoretically.
until we develop a time machine and can go back in time and talk to the people in the Stone Age, and learn a way to communicate with them somehow, and do ethnographic field work with people during the Stone Age, we will not ever know for sure what they lived like. Just as we will not ever know for sure what dinosaurs lived like, we'll never know for sure whether or not they had feathers or scales. We can only go based on what the evidence that we have.
You don't have to go to extremes here. When you find a complex of tools in caves, say, that you radiocarbon date to 50,000 BC.
Well, how do you know they're tools? You're just making an inference from other societies that have tools. How do you know that society actually used those stones as tools?
That's why you say you don't have to take these things out to lunch, okay? If you find—
But that's an inference. That's an inference, though.
There are inferences that it's rational to make and inferences that are not. When you have—
And all mine are rational.
When you have physical objects, you can make inferences about physical objects. You cannot infer, however, ideals like religious beliefs or whether they had music. If they have flutes, that is, if they have carved bones with holes in them and you can blow in there and make noise, you can say, it's very likely that they had flute, they had music.
Then another archaeologist comes along and says that that's a shower. They put water in it and it pours water on them and it's a shower.
Well, that person would be stupid, because I don't want to talk to people who are being stupid about physical stuff.
That is a problem. Some people are.
If you find, for instance, a lot of oyster shells around. A lot of oyster shells around caves near the seashore. And you find carved things that look very much like fishing hooks and objects that people today use for fishing. It's not irrational to say that we know something about the economy of these people from 50,000 years ago.
So we do know something about their economy.
Yes, I'm saying we do now, because we have physical objects. You can infer they had fish. They were fishing. You got something to do with their diets. If we can find bones, skeletons, there's very sophisticated DNA stuff they can do today. From a tooth, a Neanderthal tooth, they can figure out what the food was being eaten by, what made that tooth grow, what type of vitamins are in there. So but you can't go into a cave and see a bunch of pictures and know exactly, they had art. Art may not even be a concept they had.
Right, that's right. That is exactly right. That's projecting our thinking onto them to say that that's individual expression. It probably was not individual expression, the way we think of art. They probably didn't have that type of individualism. It's a form of communication. It's a form of communication and recording, passing it down through the generations, which no other species can do. But also, we can be pretty sure that they would not have been able to hunt large game unless they did it collectively, an individual going. So they had to have a really tight harmonious, socially tight and kinship groups. In order to survive, they had to be in order to survive, they had to be highly collective and basically communist. They had to be communistic. They had to share. They had to.
They say that about us.
They had to.
How could they have lived in a big city like that if they weren't collectivists? Look at that. They couldn't have lived in a city like New York unless they were collectivists and they worked together in a beautiful city like that. And look at us, 10,000 years AD, and we got crime in the streets. They certainly didn't have that back in the 20th century.
We have documents.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
I'm
not following that logic. But in New York City, they were so, there was no threats from the environment. As far so back then, there are all these predators, giant predators, and this, that, and the other. In order to survive in that environment, they had to be highly socially coordinated and harmonious. That's an inference, that's from the evidence. The evidence is they were in that situation. We know they were in that situation. So you make an inference. Yeah, it's not beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's pretty good.
And that big spear could have been used to stick your neighbor with too, not just the cave bear. We don't know that.
That's the point. No, if they were doing that, they would have gone extinct.
If
they were killing each other, they would not have survived.
They are extinct. They're not around anymore.
No, they're not extinct. We're still here. We were the same species, and we're not extinct. Their species, and not only that, their population expanded. They expanded out of Africa to Asia. They were meeting the Darwinian test, the opposite of going extinct. Their population was growing. Homo sapien population was expanding, not going extinct.
Nobody's arguing that.
Right. So in order for that to happen, they had to not be killing. They had to not be fighting each other. They had to be cooperative and communal.
Some other Homo sapiens.
What?
There's war going on, and there's people.
No, there's no war. There is not war. There is not war. First of all, they don't have the weapons, but no, they're not groups going over and killing other groups and fighting them. No, war does not exist. There's no evidence of battlefields. There's no battlefields.
Scientific anthropologists, but
what?
All the speculation is just pie in the sky.
It's inferences based on evidence. It's not just idle speculation. It's inferences based on evidence.
Insufficient evidence for the inference.
In my opinion, I got sufficient evidence.
Well, you happy with it?
Yeah, I think there's sufficient evidence too.
Thank you.
Sufficient evidence to what?
That they were acting collectively. For example, when they hunt, that there wasn't war. War, they would have gone extinct.
Look, the ancient Egyptians had a class society, but they worked collectively to build the pyramids. But that didn't mean they had a harmonious society. There wasn't class oppression going on, that there weren't people who were down at the bottom.
They didn't have classes.
Who lived on their labor, but they worked collectively. You couldn't build it. The Roman Empire went out and conquered all around the Mediterranean, but they worked collectively, but it was still a big class and exploitative society. It's nice to make these speculations, but they are
these are inferences based on evidence. The Romans had such a large population, they could be killing these populations were so small, they could not have been having wars with each other.
Not within their
war is a luxury of a large population.
I think that the point that Dr. Riggins is trying to hammer out is that you can infer that there was collaboration and cooperation at play in the work itself, but it's another thing to say from that the societies existed harmoniously, or that there weren't any I mean, one of the biggest things that capitalism does is socialize production. We are cooperating all the time, but we're just cooperating through relations mediated by antagonistic classes, right? So I think that's part of the point that he's trying to hammer out. To what extent can we take that awareness that there was collaboration in these primary communities to the conclusion that therefore there were no classes, right? And that gets to the question of the relationship of collaboration with class society, or distinctions, or relations of oppression and exploitation, because, and part of that relationship has to be understood by the very fact that we have cooperation today through mechanisms of class exploitation and these other things. So I think it's not irrational to say, yes, you can have collaboration, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the form of collaboration that's like harmonious, socially harmonious.
But it could be. It probably is.
There is not
because
evidence of there's not evidence of there being a hierarchical structure in the Stone Age societies. There is evidence that we have ethnographic evidence of societies that existed in the 60s and 70s, and some still exist today, of these of societies being harmonious, having a hunter-gatherer mode of production, and not having class, and not, you know, and having maybe a limited understanding of private property or personal property, but having a collective view towards property in general.
Yes.
There is evidence, there's ethnographic evidence of that, which we can infer, you know. So there is a gap there is a problem that the ethnographic evidence was collected from societies that existed in the 60s until now, much of it, and that we can't know for sure what they did in the Stone Age, but we do, you know, we can make inferences based on the evidence we have, and that's the best we can do. That's what a theory is.
You're 100%. That's all I was saying. We don't know, but we make inferences. But people can make counter inferences.
It may not be beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's a preponderance of the evidence, as we say in the law. It's a pretty good. We have a certain we have a level of certainty. We have a certain level of certainty. It's like in court, you know, you can't know anything beyond a you know, you can't know anything. What is it? Without any doubt. There's nothing we know without any doubt. But we know, for example, in court, beyond a reasonable doubt. We have a pretty high level of certainty on that they didn't have classes, that they didn't have war. They might have fighting. There's a difference between fighting and war. That doesn't mean there were no fights between individuals, but there wasn't war. That's preponderance of the evidence, if you want
to. Comrade Khaled, did you have a question to close us out? Because I had one more thought that I wanted to bring up, but I don't know if it's going to take us too far. We're about to hit the 2-hour mark.
Yeah, I had a question, but I think it fit a while back. It would have fit with the discussion of writing. But if you have one that'll close this out, go ahead.
Sure. So one of the things that has been included in Latin American Marxism, specifically in countries like Bolivia and their plurinational form of socialism, is an attempt to effect a sort of cultural decolonization. And I know that this word is tossed around a lot, and usually it's done by academics with liberal leanings who are usually hostile to the movement of socialism. But what in essence they mean is a reformulation of how we think of what Hegel would have called universal history. And including within our understanding the rich civilizations that existed in the Americas, the richness of the Chinese civilization, which basically mapped the whole world by 1423, a while almost 100 years before America was so-called discovered. So how do these studies of anthropology, and perhaps more specifically economic anthropology, help us understand better the how do they aid in sort of deconstructing a Eurocentric understanding of history? And tied to that, how do they help us understand socialism and the struggle for socialism in these different parts of the world differently, or in how they must be considered with a certain level of uniqueness? Because the communities, the socialism that's being built in Bolivia is very different than the socialism that would be built in a place like the United States. So how does economic anthropology, or anthropology more broadly, how does it help us understand this sort of this process of decolonization understood under those terms?
One of the things that's interesting to me is to think about what kind of system would have been established if Europeans hadn't taken over North and South America. And we know that, we know that disease killed a very large portion of the population. And perhaps, although there is a lot of debate about this, the Europeans maybe didn't even realize how much devastation they had caused until they went back and said, oh, this is a basically uninhabited continent, or two basically uninhabited continents. But it was after they had already been there and spread smallpox, and so many of the people had died. So I wonder, I don't know. I think contingency, in history sometimes is problematic, because I do think there are certain sort of forces that maybe are universal. But it's interesting to think of, what if the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was allowed to evolve, for centuries? What would it have looked like? Would they have made a deal? Would they have made some kind of federation with the other native nations in North America and formed some kind of, a continent-wide federation? Who knows? I don't know, but I think that that's an interesting thing to look at. And like I said earlier, I mean, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, but it might be a way for some of these nations to think of a way forward that's not dominated by European ideas. And I know in the socialist movements in Latin America, a lot of them appeal to like in Peru, Maria Tegui and these leaders that are from the nations, there, as opposed to, these internationally renowned figures like Marx or Lenin. And so I think that's an interesting idea, is to kind of look back at the the cultures that still exist and see how can that maybe be incorporated in a larger program.
Mitch, you mentioned twice. I was going to say it in the first time, but I didn't. So I have to say it now. It's almost a cosmic symbol. They use the toothpaste example twice. And I saw a video where they take out the toothpaste and they put it back in through the back and they squeeze it out, and the three lines still come out nicely, even though they mixed it. So I don't know what's going on there.
That's a sin. That's blasphemy.
You don't know how the three lines work. Around the top, where it just comes out of the tube, the three-line color thing is put in. So whatever you put in down at the bottom, it's going to go through that. When it comes out, the lines are going to be there.
That's a real Hegelian, no? And understanding all things in their utmost concreteness. But any comments about that?
I don't see much use for anthropology. I mean, certainly, you know, decolonize as far as preserving a given culture, you know, but as far as I use Marxism, Leninism for decolonization. You know, I don't think anthropology has that much to offer, you know, that we don't already have.
Well, I don't think we're going to get rid of Eurocentrism, because one of the oldest cultures and strongest cultures in the world is the culture of China. And China is building its society based on a 19th century German's ideas mixed in with traditional ideas of Confucius. So if the Chinese are going to be built Euro, I don't see how these other cultures are going to survive what Marx, Engels clearly said was happening in the manifesto. The bourgeoisie has gone around to the most remote areas of the world and destroyed everything there and created the world in the image of capitalism for trade. And socialism is the answer to that. So I think
Yeah, I've heard people.
the European Marxism, Leninism, that is, of course, it will reflect indigenous cultures and reflect the values. They're not all going to be like, the Chinese aren't going to be like German communists. Hopefully they'll survive.
I've heard people say that, you know, Marxism is not, you know, because Marx is a god or anything, but it's just, he just discovered a basic truth about history, about class struggle. And, you know, the fact that Darwin was, you know, English doesn't mean that, you know, he didn't discover you know, something that was true, right? Doesn't mean that the theory of evolution is a Eurocentric theory. So you know, but we do have to identify those elements. But you know, I mean, of course, you know, Marx and Lenin, two of the most influential thinkers throughout the world, and that's not just in Europe and Asia, that's in Africa and Latin America and everywhere else too. So
If I might agree with you, I mean, going back to when I was at the Yurok Indian Reservation, and, you know, this issue of, you know, return to primary culture, if possible, as being, you know, being unrealistic and all that. But what you know, as you just said, basically, the bourgeoisie have conquered the globe. You know, capitalism is everywhere. So the only and it dominates, and the only way you can open up to revival of various indigenous cultures is first to expropriate the expropriators. You know what I'm saying? Then
Yeah,
we can go
There's
to
there's a point that the so-called most dangerous philosopher in the world, Slavoj Žižek, there's a point that he makes, which is that the Haitian Revolution was able to go through France and colonialism precisely by taking the ideals of the French Revolution. And I think that's a basic dialectics. You don't go outside to then go around something, you go directly through it. So if we're going to have any form of socialism that appears in these countries, it's always going to have to incorporate part of that which has held them down, and that's going to have to be used to move beyond it. So any final comments by any of the panelists?
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on, Charles. Any comments? Anyone else? Mitch, Thomas?
I would say don't throw out the unilinear model completely. I think it's useful.
As a Hegelian, I like it as well.
Especially since Europeans have taken over the whole world. Basically, their model applies to the whole world now.
I would say this, though, I don't think it's incompatible, the thesis of the unilateral theory of history, that capitalism is, the last part of it, that capitalism is bound to spread globally, with a multilateral understanding of what comes before capitalism in these different regions of the world, right? So the universalization of capital is still applicable in a multilateral theory of history, in my opinion, right?
That's a good synthesis, speaking of Hegel.
If we knew the Weltgeist moves from the east to the west, but
The sun rises from the east, yeah.
Where the Weltgeist is headed now is something we have to figure out.
You know, Hegel said it would end in Germany, but I think that it kind of tripped up and it kept on going and it went back, and it seems like it's heading towards China.
Got kicked out of Germany about 30 years ago.
Still one hell of a book, one of my favorites, but yeah.
Lenin said,
Okay.
just to let you know, Lenin said that was the least interesting of the Hegel books, as far as he was concerned.
I don't know. It's a fun read. It's the
preface,
one that we would least agree with.
The introduction, which is published as a separate little booklet, the
reason in history.
That's important, but the actual history that he's doing in there is
it's a lot of BS.
He didn't know much about Africa and African civilization. He didn't know much about the Egyptians. He didn't know much about India, China. What did
Hegel know about women? Does he say anything about women?
What's the analogy that he makes?
They knew their place.
Like plants. Yeah.
Wow.
He knew where they fit into the world skirt.
It's got a real big deficiency in his thinking there.
Kirke.
A few ones.
Kirke, Kuka, Kinder. KKK of Germany.
Kala, any comments?
No, thank you for an interesting discussion. Economic anthropology is a particular interest of mine, so this is a delight. Thank you all.
Yeah, I would restate that this was our first Midwestern Marx panel. We hope to do more like these at least once a month. Hopefully we can start to do them with more frequency. But I really appreciate it, and I thought it was a very interesting and delightful, enjoyable discussion. So thank you all for being here. Kala, thank you for co-hosting with me, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks again.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thanks.